I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you who don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it, took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up in. It overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings and such. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbits or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night, but so lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was around 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up. Maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. Just then, I heard a crunch from over in the direction I had come from earlier. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, but a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden, I thought? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements. He was like a squirrel or something, twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help, please! I can't walk!" the voice called out. That's when I called nonsense. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with incredible ease for a naked person. So well, I mistook him for a bear. This was a trap. This guy was trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't care in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on, I buckled my chest strap and scrambled back for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw him smile. The thermoscope has this effect that makes an animal's eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "Piss off!" I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet, and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will mess you up. Go away!" He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass, like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling, and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left toward the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round, and tried to pocket the mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it, and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I just wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab, but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. Never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen it, just 50 miles east of there. He was so spooked his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've since gone down the rabbit hole of these scary stories, and I'm not saying what I saw was definitely a wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm just saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, I thought I'd share. So, about 5 years ago, a friend and I were hiking in the Oregon Cascades in the mid-spring. We were about 6 miles in from the road, nowhere near a trail, on about 6 feet of snow. We were going out for 5 days to attempt to summit a few peaks, so we looked like grizzly mountain men. Around a tree came 2 guys and a dog, one mid-50s, his son mid-20s, and Fifi. They were wearing trail running shorts, running shoes, and a running water backpack, aka nothing of real use. "PCT open?" they asked. My friend and I looked at each other, then back at them, and tried not to laugh as we explained. "We're 5 miles from the PCT and 2,000 feet lower in elevation. What are you trying to do?" They planned on doing a 20-mile run along the PCT starting on the other side of the mountains, but got sidetracked due to snow. Again, we explained to them that they were screwed. I told them there was a road with cell service 6 miles downhill along our tracks, and if need be, we could hike them out. They refused, and asked if the PCT was open again. I flat out told them, "You are screwed, let me hike you out." They were like, "Nah, we've got this," and ran off in the wrong direction. We camped there for the night and followed their tracks for a half-mile the next morning. They disappeared. No signs of them. After a few stormy days and failed summit attempts, we hiked out. I drove around to the parking area they mentioned and looked through the wilderness permit tags to try and find the name. Nothing. It gets weird, though. A few years later, my parents ran into the same nondescript people in the same area again, asking about a trail loop. Same conditions, too. Late winter, snowshoeing far from a road, and they were lost. My dad also tried to hike them out, but they denied and took off in the wrong direction. He followed their tracks for a half-mile before he lost them, too. When I was a teenager, we went away for a week of camping at the Scout Reserve. My dad was our scoutmaster, and we were mostly all friends from growing up. There was one kid, Andre, the youngest, that we didn't really know well, and was definitely kind of weird, withdrawn and awkward, just kind of different, but still a sweet guy that everyone liked. Toward the end of the week, we went out on an overnight, just the scouts without my dad or his buddy, who was our other scouter. We took a boat across the lake, then hiked for hours into the bush. It was a really hot day, and my older brother was leading us, but not drinking any water, and wearing a light jacket, which made him extra hot. Eventually, we found a sweet spot next to a huge cliff, which we jumped off of into the lake below for hours, until we made a fire and cooked dinner. Eventually, we all fell asleep under the stars. Around 4:30 a.m., just before sunrise, my friend Sean woke me up and asked if I knew where Andre was. I said no, and that maybe he went to pee, but after 5 minutes he still wasn't back, so he got up and started looking around and calling his name. Nothing. So we ranged a little further, and then I saw his sleeping bag at the edge of the cliff. I freaked out and ran over to see if I could see anything at the bottom, but I saw nothing. We tried to get my brother up, but he was pretty sick from heat stroke, so I took charge of the situation. We started ranging out into the woods and calling his name. One of the guys started doing the emergency whistle call, 3 short whistles, but we really were in the middle of nowhere. I started going deeper into the woods, calling his name. Then I thought I heard something. I stopped and listened, and heard a faint cry deep in the woods. So I started running, crashing through thick undergrowth, getting lashed in the face with branches and stumbling across fallen logs. His cries got louder, and eventually I arrived to this huge clearing in the woods, to find him sitting on a fallen tree in his underwear and a t-shirt. He said he'd been there for hours, having woken up on the ground in the dark, having no idea where he was. So he just sat it out, waiting for dawn. It was really spooky. The craziest thing was that his watch had been reset, so he had no idea what time it actually was. We all accepted that it was probably sleepwalking, but he was so far into the woods and didn't have a scratch on him, and this clearing was so bizarre. It was big and round, in the middle of these really dense woods. To this day, I wonder what really happened. Back in high school, I lived with my mom out in the country. Not like Deliverance territory. There was reception and decent internet out there, and the nearest neighbors weren't 10 miles away. You didn't hear banjo music out in the woods or anything. But we were a good 25-minute drive from the nearest town, not counting little gas stations that dotted the area here and there. Next to the house was a dead-end road. I can't remember the name, as this was years ago, but I always used to take walks up and down that road after school or on weekends. especially when the weather was nice. Sometimes I'd go all the way to the end, sometimes just halfway. There were houses down the road, of course, but there were abandoned structures too. Stuff like abandoned trailers and ramshackle barns. I've always been sort of interested in urban exploration, but back then I didn't have my own car, so it was kind of hard to get to places that seemed cool enough to explore. There was one place in particular that always intrigued me. It was a barn set next to an abandoned farmhouse behind a fence. One of those black iron fences that you see in cliché haunted house movies. Me and some friends had actually run into the guy who owned the land at one point, and he said he didn't mind us poking around there, as long as we weren't doing anything illegal or defacing the property or anything. My friends and I were never into being jerks like that, so it never even occurred to us, and we thanked him for the opportunity. One day during the summer, I had two of my best friends over. We spent most of the day playing Guitar Hero and Quake 3 and whatnot, but eventually the video games got boring. It was a nice day, and it was getting late, somewhere around 5 or 6 p.m. if I remember correctly, so I brought up the idea of taking a walk down the dead-end road. They both agreed that going outside would be a nice change, and we grabbed a few water bottles and headed out. On the way down the road, I mentioned the house and barn to my friends, and they agreed that this would be a good time to go exploring. We're all a little weird in that we like being scared, and the country can get pretty creepy at night with all the weird sounds of nature around you. We made our way to the house, climbed the fence, and dropped down into the yard. The house was almost totally full of hay, which we thought was strange, but I was more interested in the barn anyway. We went inside and started poking around, looking at all the old, rusted farm equipment, but unfortunately there wasn't much of interest inside. We went outside to the back of the barn to see where it led, and we were surprised and pretty excited to see that it went down a path into the woods. We didn't even think twice before going down the path. We only walked for a couple of minutes before the path opened up into a big, wide clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. It felt pretty surreal, and we all split off in different directions and wandered around the clearing for a while. Then my friend called us over from the left side of the clearing. He was looking down at something on the ground, only about 10 or 15 feet from the tree line. We went over to see what it was, and to our surprise, it was a big burn pit, probably 5 by 5 feet. There were old cans, mugs, and other burned up junk, all piled haphazardly into this pit, and we decided to poke through it to see if there was anything valuable or cool that we could take back as a memento. We'd only been digging for a minute or so when my friend pulled up a small white object that I immediately recognized as a bone. This didn't strike me as odd at first, since a lot of hunters around that area will toss unwanted animal remains into burn pits on their property, and it's a convenient way to get rid of them. But as we dug deeper, we kept pulling more bones out, and they started getting bigger, like uncomfortably big. When my friend yanked one out that was about the size of my forearm, I decided we needed to figure out what was going on. My dad is a medical professional, and one of his specialties is reading x-rays, meaning he can identify bones pretty much at a glance. So I took a picture of the bone pile and sent it to him, saying something like, "Hey Dad, me and some buddies just found these out in a field. Can you tell what they're from?" I got his response about 30 seconds later. "Those look human, son." I showed my friends the text, and they kind of nervously laughed, but I didn't find this funny at all. We'd been out for almost 2 hours, which meant that it was almost dark, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught out in the middle of nowhere in some psycho's murder pit. As soon as that thought crossed my mind, we heard something from the tree line, like a branch snapping under someone's foot. Every trace of laughter died, and we all snapped around to look at the tree line. Nobody moved until that snapping sound came again, and this time I saw some kind of figure moving around in there, like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. I screamed, "Go!" and we all took off, basically non-stop sprinting all the way back to my house without looking back. For some stupid reason that I still don't understand, we didn't call the cops. None of us were comfortable around police officers, and though my dad urged me to at least send an anonymous tip, we never did. I went back out to that area a few weeks later in broad daylight carrying my machete, and the burn pit and bones were gone. There were still scorch marks around where it had been, obviously, and a few pieces of trash still there, but the evidence, if that's what it was, had vanished. I still wonder about that pit sometimes, and I wonder if we inadvertently stumbled into some kind of burial site where a murderer routinely came to revisit the scene of the crime. I know that sounds dramatic and cliché, but it makes the most sense in my mind. Sometimes I regret not calling the cops, but there's nothing I can do about it now. I lived in an aged urban Alabamian town most of my life, and as is the case with most of Alabama, you're never more than 15 minutes away from an extremely rural area. Between the ages of 11 and 13, I hung out with a bro that lived near the woods, so I have a few good in-a-woods stories. This one time I was at his house. To the side and behind it was a clearing surrounded by crops and pastures. Beyond the crops and pastures were woods with very large trees, but fairly spaced out. They were tall enough to block out a lot of light, yet sparse enough for there to not really be a designated trail. There were no houses for half a mile in either direction, and it was pretty poorly lit, so on clear nights you really could see a lot of the sky. He had a friend that lived at the end of the road about half a mile down who we'd sometimes visit. One day we were walking back from there to my bro's house, and as we were approaching the darkest point, maybe the halfway mark between houses, I could slightly make out what appeared to be a white shed in the woods. I mentioned it to my bro, and he saw it too. We both stopped when we were directly across from it on the road. We could distinctly make out the borders of the shed, and even notice the shape of a window frame. We both stared for a minute, because we knew with absolute certainty that there was never a shed there, and it was right on the border of the woods, so it would have been apparent if it ever were. Suddenly, there was an ear-burstingly loud crash from inside. My friend and I strained every ounce of energy we had in our bodies to sprint until our lungs gave out to make it back. We went back there the following day, and there was no shed. This happened when I was at the same friend's house. His dad is ex-military, with boxes of MREs and all sorts of guns stored in the house. In the sparse backwoods that I mentioned before, they owned a school bus that his dad used to hunt in. It had a bed, shelves of MREs, a couch, a love seat, a toilet, wood stove, 2 barrels of filtered water, and a television. Anyway, me, my bro, and 3 other friends hiked out to the woods to stay the night in the bus. We brought snacks, blankets, a couple portable DVD players, and some movies. My bro's dad made us take a walkie-talkie out there, but said not to wake him unless it was an emergency. Anyway, I was kicking it with my bros, having a great time for a few hours. And around 3 a.m., our DVD players and phones had died, so we were just talking, playing card games, and Would You Rather. It got quiet at one point, and we noticed the bus started shaking slightly. No one said anything, but the silence continued because we all acknowledged it, just not aloud. A few minutes passed, and when nothing else happened, we started talking again. Then the bus started shaking again, a little harder this time. Someone said, "Did you guys feel that, or am I imagining it?" Everyone felt it. We all went dead silent and waited. When we heard the grass rustle around the back of the bus, we all started flipping out and frantically pulling up all the windows we had open. The bus started shaking violently, and we heard the screeching sound of something sharp scraping or clawing at the side of the bus near us. The oldest guy there was literally crying and hiding under a blanket, not saying a word, while the rest of us were running around freaking out. We heard a very low growl coming from directly beneath the window we were closest to. We were all frozen in place. A few minutes passed, and nothing happened. We were looking for the walkie-talkie to call my friend's dad, but we couldn't find it anywhere. During all this, there was a blood-curdling shriek from outside. Almost all of us were in tears at that point. Words were getting caught in our throats as we were frantically searching for the walkie-talkie. The moron that had been frozen solid, not saying a word underneath the blanket and crying for 10 minutes, turned out to be laying on it. The bus was shaking harder than ever, and we were still hearing footsteps around the bus in between shakes. My friend called his dad on the walkie-talkie and was screaming at him to come down there. He told him that something was shaking the bus and clawing at it. He told us he was on his way, and to stay inside and not open the door for anything but him. A couple of minutes passed by, and the shakes got progressively lighter. Suddenly, we saw my friend's dad sprinting down the trail towards the bus with some assault rifle with a light attached to it. He told us to stay in the bus. He made a couple of passes around it, looking for whatever it was. He came back and told us he didn't see anything. We followed him closely as he led us back to the house, gun up and at the ready. None of us spoke to each other for the rest of the night. The next day, his dad said he thought it was likely a mountain lion, but none of us bought it for a second. I can't imagine anything with less than human strength could shake the bus as much as it was shaking. To this day, that night remains the single most terrifying night of my life, and that was like 7 years ago. I think that may have been the only time I felt genuine terror. I actually feared for my life that night. The most obvious answer would likely be a bear, but it was winter and there aren't many bears in that part of Alabama. It remains a possibility, but that screech sounded way too human. I live 5 miles from a wildlife refuge, which I ride my bike to every day. This time it was raining, which was no big deal. I got to the refuge and did the usual, which was to hike or bike down every trail. This time I noticed the wind was getting stronger, but I was unbothered, until the wind was howling. I stopped and watched the trees and found that they were swaying so much it was unbelievable. At that point I was already starting to worry, but I was almost done with my circuit. There was no sense in stopping now. I was on my way to this public boat landing. On this road there was marsh on one side and woods on the other. Then I saw it. There was a trail through the woods that I had never seen. I had been there a million times and never noticed it. It opened onto the roadside like an ominous maw. At that point, the wind was deafening, and it was raining so hard I couldn't even see down the road. But I decided to stash the bike and go in a woods. Around the first bend, the howling wind started to sound distant. Very little of the rain was filtering through the branches overhead. Around the next bend, I found the remains of an old house. It had collapsed a long time ago. The wooden parts long since rotted away. The only thing left was the twisted, crumbling brick foundation and the toppled chimney. I walked around these ruins instead of through them. The wind was still howling beyond the trees, but it had apparently stopped raining, so I decided to press on. I rounded another bend and heard a snap. Something very large and fast bolted through the trees and out of view. I was startled, but quickly noticed there was another one bounding away from me. I noticed the tail in the shade. It was just a deer. A third took off in my direction, a baby deer. The little guy scattered like his mom and dad without knowing what he was fleeing from. He saw me, then skittered to a halt and changed direction. There were no more deer, so I just considered it a neat encounter and pressed on some more. When I rounded the next bend, I heard another snap, then some more movement. I hunched down and got still. Then I heard it. The growling. It was definitely growling, and it was definitely coming from around the next bend. Then I realized, what happened to the wind? I heard even more growling, and felt my hair stand up on end. The rush of fear hit my stomach. Slowly and quietly, I picked up a big stick. I thought to myself, what are you gonna do with a big stick? Good point, me. So I picked up another stick, and now I had 2 sticks. This plan was foolproof. I started walking backwards slowly, and eventually got back to my bike. I left the refuge, with the wind now stronger than ever. The rain was back. In fact, it was raining so hard that I could only see a few feet in front of me. Several trees were laying across the road, and the wind was blowing against me. It was so strong that I couldn't pedal forward. Suddenly, I saw headlights approaching. My dad had loaded my brother into the SUV and come looking for me. Apparently, I left the house when the storm was just a storm. It developed into a high-level hurricane while I was in the refuge. I got home and dried off without further incident. Now, whenever I go in the woods, I'm extra vigilant. I went back to that spot days later. The trail was just gone. Even as an adult, I go back from time to time and look for that trail. I haven't seen it since. I go hiking in these woods once or twice a year. The place is called Cannock Chase in Staffordshire, England. It has a reputation as a paranormal hotspot. This isn't so much a story as a series of spooky happenings. When going through the woods at night, I can hear voices. As soon as I stop, I hear nothing, and when I start again, I can hear the voices whispering again. I've had this happen a few times. I've also seen a lot of evidence of strange rituals up there. Flower petals laid out around a stone, bags full of bones hanging low in a tree. One night I was having trouble sleeping, so I went for a short walk near camp. I was headed down this short trail near camp for about 10 minutes, when I heard some shouting. I kept walking down and realized that it was some sort of chanting. It sounded like a kiwi haka, but more rhythmic. I slowed my pace, but kept walking down. It was getting louder and louder. I was getting real close and started to feel like I was being watched. At that point, I just noped out of there, which really isn't like me. Typically I don't get scared, but that night I did. I've also had some strange animal encounters up there. I was walking down this heavily wooded trail, at night again, and noticed an eye shine to the left. I continued on and noticed that the animal had begun to follow me. It was a large, dog-sized animal that probably followed me for about a mile. It kept its distance, but it was very unnerving. This one time I had been on a very long night hike. I was only 3-ish miles from camp. The trail led out of the woods and through this short, grassy hill. I was about halfway through when I shone my flashlight behind, and I saw some eye shine. The animal was about 150 feet away, low down in the tall grass. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was still, so I walked on for about 20 seconds. I turned around, and it was a lot closer. It had closed about half the distance. I could now see it was a lot larger than I originally thought. The eyes were wider and higher than any other animal I've seen in England. It was some sort of big cat for sure. I started walking backwards, facing the creature. It just straight up started leaping and running towards me. And this thing was huge, like 6 or 7 feet long. I started shouting as loud as I could, waving my arms in the air, desperately trying to walk backwards as fast as possible without taking my eyes off. It stopped as soon as I started shouting, but it was still following me. I probably walked almost half a mile backwards facing this thing. It eventually lost interest, but if I hadn't noticed it in the first place, I wouldn't be here. I'm sure of that. Thing is, England isn't supposed to have any natural predators. Wolves died out by the 17th century, and bears a few centuries before that. Another user responds, "Evening. I live in Rugeley, and a few lads from school and I used to bike up to the Chase most weekends. We witnessed some creepy stuff there. I was about 12 in 2002 or so. We'd usually take our Saturday bike ride to the Chase. Races, climbing trees, etc. Anyway, we were just hanging when we saw a girl a little ways into the woods. She was in a weird paisley dress and brown boots, covered in mud. It was very quiet. We were all spooked, but playing it cool. Eventually we called out, and she came a little closer. We realized that was some weird mud. She spoke to us and asked what we were doing, and asked if she could play. We were kind of freaking out, but played it cool for each other. She wouldn't properly come out of the woods, and was still quiet. She seemed a little too young to be out there. We asked where her parents were, and she said she didn't know. We asked her name, and she said Diane. We all made the eyes to leave. We turned to say bye, and she wasn't there. This could have been a brilliant prank, but this was before the YouTube prank trend was even a thought. And to add more, I spoke to my grandma about this. Turns out, as my mam was a baby, there had been a few murders carried out in Cannock Chase, and one was a little girl called Diana. We went back a few times after to see if anything would happen, but when it went quiet like it did, we always got creeped out and left. In the summer of 2007, I had just graduated high school. Sometime in late July, a good friend of mine suggested to me and a few other friends that we head up to a cabin his parents owned for a week. It was about a 5-hour drive, and we didn't hit the road until late. About 3 hours into the drive, all of a sudden there was a loud bang and pop sound, followed by this dud-dud-dud-dud coming from the back right wheel. We pulled over, and the friend who owned the car and I got out to inspect the damages. Turns out we had a flat. We were in the middle of nowhere, and it was pitch black, and neither of us had ever had to change a tire before, but we decided to do our best with it. As we were pulling out the spare, I got this feeling like something was watching me, a kind of tingling feeling in my shoulders and neck. I kept looking over, but I couldn't see a thing beyond the first trees. It was just way too dark. As we were loosening the lug nuts, I kept looking over, and I ended up catching my friend's eyes. He kind of leaned over and whispered, "You feel that too?" I nodded in agreement. We kept working silently, doing our best, and finally got the car jacked up. By now our other friends were also outside the car, and no one was talking. We were still fumbling with getting the tire off. One friend yelled out suddenly, saying he saw something just run out of the woods and back in. Now he was saying we needed to hurry up. We were going as fast as we could, but soon enough another friend let off a scream, and he was flat on his rear. He said something came up to his side and pushed him down. We all heard this giggling. We were about to just give up when this old beat-up pickup truck came by. It stopped and this dude jumped out, real redneck-like, which isn't too common in northern Michigan. He said, clear as day, "You boys got a flat?" We nodded to say yes. I'm sure the fear in our eyes showing. You shouldn't be out here near these woods this late. Finally, a man who knew what he was doing helped us out. We got the tire switched and he sent us on our way. There was an old abandoned house in the middle of the woods that the locals here call the Victoria House. Rumor has it that a family tragically died one Christmas Eve when the house caught fire. People believed it because, year after year, someone's house in the neighborhood would catch fire on Christmas Eve, for various reasons, be it fireplace, bad electrical wiring. You can allegedly see the shadows of the family and children burned into the walls. I had been there many times during the day. Hobos would squat there, so there was a lot of litter and garbage around from this. There was also a hammock set up between two metal pipes from where the house had been retrofitted for indoor plumbing. I decided that this was where I'd spend the night. From the hammock, you could see the night sky through where the fire gutted through the second floor ceiling, attic, and roof. There wasn't really a second floor per se, more like an indoor balcony of sorts. I laid there comfortably with a pipe wrench in my hand because self-defense. I went to sleep, despite my hyperactive imagination, which caused me to see shadows sliding around in the darkness. I woke some hours later. The night was quiet, and the moon was full. There was a cool and gentle breeze blowing, and the stars were blazing brightly, despite the brightness of the moon. It was very serene. I was laying there enjoying the night, and began idly tapping the pipe wrench against an exposed piece of metal pipe. I would make a few taps, and then, after a few moments, my taps would repeat themselves, almost like an echo, but not exactly timed the same. Tap, 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 tap. I did this for a while, and each time my pattern would almost timidly be repeated, tap for tap, with a slightly hesitant cadence, as if something were asking, "Was this your pattern?" I was mildly mortified, but not overwhelmed with terror. I simply rolled over, clutching the pipe wrench closely, and went back to sleep. I returned home the next morning without incident. Fast forward to the year afterward. Our family had moved temporarily to a rental home just west of the city. Why? Because the previous year, our chimney had caught fire on Christmas Eve. I grew up in a hill town in the part of New York State between Albany and New York City. We moved there when I was 7 from a busy town, and the place seemed completely isolated. My parents owned about 10 acres, and our land was surrounded by huge fields on the north and south. The road was to the east, and behind our house in the west was a huge forest with various ponds and streams. It was a cool place to grow up, and I was a big Calvin and Hobbes fan. I would pack up my red wagon early in the morning and wander the hills and trails until the sun began to set. During my travels, I found a few things that spooked me, and still make it difficult for me to go out there unless I'm with a friend or on my four-wheeler. I found a really old graveyard not too far from my house. It was probably a family plot. It was surrounded by a rotting fence, and tucked in the corner of a large, overgrown field. I discovered it when I was about 10, and remembered it existed when I was 17. I invited a few of my good friends over and planned something of an expedition, because I wanted to get charcoal rubbings of the graves and do some research. We were out for hours, and it just didn't exist anymore. I spent a lot of time out there and knew my way around really well. To this day, I can't find it, even though I'm certain I know where it is. I'm 24 now, and last time I was home, I took a ride to see if I could find it, but still no luck. On that same trip, my friends and I came across a cabin-like structure. It was really overgrown, to the point you wouldn't be able to see it unless you knew what you were looking for. My friend just happened to spot it with his flashlight. Inside, we found peeling wallpaper, old broken furniture, and an incredible amount of weird religious reading material and crosses inside of a stanky cooler. The weirdest part was that the floor was made of wooden slats, and the slats had small gaps between them. Shining my big mag light down one of the cracks, my beam showed the rough bottom, at least 100 feet down. I might be wrong about this, it was hard to judge the depth, but it was ridiculous. I can't imagine why a house would be built on a hole in that manner. There was no way down, no trapdoor, nothing. The attic of the house was full of large bags arranged in piles. It smelled like hell up there, and we spent no time there. By then it was 1 or 2 in the morning, so our senses were on edge as it was. Another time I was hiking with my best friend, and we came upon a large flat stone with a puddle of blood and bone fragments on it. The trees in the area were cut down and arranged in weird, stacked shapes, reminding us of the Blair Witch Project, which we had recently watched. Nearby down the trail was an old camper, spray-painted woodland camo and, like the cabin, very well hidden. A camp was set up, and it was pretty clear someone was nearby. We didn't dare go inside. On the journey home, we met a man on the trail. I remember he was really unkempt, with a disgusting beard and dirty face. His eyes, one of which was lazy, were either incredibly bloodshot, or he had some serious pink eye. His camouflage clothing was so dirty I could hardly tell it was camouflage. He had 2 shotguns, one on his back and one in his hands, and a huge knife on his waist. He said to us, "We gonna be running deer soon. You best get out of the area. And if you don't know, running deer means we driving a truck through the woods and shooting anything that moves." Needless to say, we got out of there. I found more trailers in the woods with similar results. I want to think that the people living out there were just disgusting rednecks, but something always made me feel like they were up to something a little more sinister. These same people ended up accidentally shooting our house at one point, but that's a different story entirely. Not being able to find that cemetery drives me nuts. I know these stories aren't scary, but they were scary at the time and very real, so I thought they might be relevant. I hope it was worth the read. This happened in Norway, in a forest centuries old. I was 24 at the time, and an avid mountain biker. I headed out on a less traveled trail with a friend. We were having a blast. The terrain was tricky but fun. We'd been out for hours, and it started getting dark. We decided to make our way back to the car when we started hearing a faint piano. We thought it might be coming from a cabin somewhere nearby. We continued to hear this faint music, like a classic piano, slightly off key. No clue what the song was. No matter where we went, or how far we were, we continued to faintly hear it. We were both starting to freak out, and it was getting darker and darker. We were kinda concerned that maybe we'd ventured too far to find our way back at night. It was dark, and my friend had the only light. That music was still repeating, slightly off key, and always in the distance. We had heard it over an hour ago, yet it was still the same. Eventually, we were able to figure out where we were. We got to the car and disassembled our bikes. Somehow, the music was getting louder. Both of us were working like mad to get our bikes in the trunk. Finally, we managed to get in the car and tear out of there. We never went back, and never figured out what the music was or where it came from. It had a real eerie tone to it, like an old piano that hasn't been played for a long time. At first we could barely hear it, but we'd hear it every time we stopped. The last 10 minutes was the freakiest. It somehow got louder. I'm sitting here with goosebumps just writing about it. I was picking up a trailer from an unattended, unlit, unpaved dirt lot deep in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas. There was literally nothing but woods for miles around, except for this drop lot. The idiot shuttle driver left the landing gear fully extended on all the trailers. It's a pain to crank them down when they're loaded, so I cranked for 15 minutes before pausing to take a break. I was leaning against the trailer, and all was perfectly quiet. Suddenly, I heard footsteps slowly approach from the rear of the trailer. I thought that was strange, as I didn't hear another vehicle. Hello? The footsteps stopped, but there was no reply. I pulled out my phone and turned the light on. I still couldn't see anything. Of course, my real flashlight had to get stolen a few weeks ago. I flipped on every light the truck had and got back outside. Anybody out there? Silence. I started cranking the landing gear again, while looking around with my camera light, getting paranoid. The footsteps resumed. What are you doing? I started to think it might be a bear or something. Suddenly, from the darkness under the trailer right next to me, like 2 feet away, "Be careful," in a normal, adult male voice. I jumped about 10 feet away, maybe yelped a little. I shined the light under the trailer. Nothing. I took a picture. Also nothing. I climbed back in that truck and drove away. Didn't come back for the trailer until the next day. I used to live in the middle of nowhere in Northern California, the small cultish town called Cottonwood. Every weekend, my mom and stepdad would kick me out of the house because they're morons, tell me to go play, have an imagination. They'd lock the door and tell me not to come back until sundown. The closest neighbors were 3 miles away. We lived on a fairly large property, never knew exactly how big it was. Behind our house was this gigantic forest. I used to go into it all the time. I'd never go too far in because I was always by myself and it was scary. I decided one day, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go all the way. I grabbed this pipe I always carried with me. It was steel. I'd always pretend it was a sword, and headed in. I walked for hours. I remember that. Thorn bushes everywhere. I got cuts all over my arms, legs, face. I don't remember too much of the journey. I only remember the ending. Really well, too. I finally got to a fence after, I would guess, about 2 or 3 hours of walking. It was an old wooden fence that was kind of rotting. It had a lot of wear and tear. The fence went to my left and right as far as I could see. It just seemed to go on forever. The fence was only up to about my shoulders, so I climbed over it and kept going. I figured, why not? The forest was always pretty dense, but after I climbed over the fence, it seemed to get so dense that not much light from the sun was breaking through. I walked for a few minutes more before I made my way around a final tree. And that's when I saw it. I will never forget this. Out in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, was a gigantic spider web. A gigantic spider web made of barbed wire. It was easily 15 or 20 feet in height and width. It completely blocked me from going any farther. I stood there for probably a minute or two, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. Why was this thing way out here? Who put it here? Then, a voice. "Long way from home, aren't we, boy?" I jumped a mile. I turned a little to my right, and there was this decrepit hillbilly just looking at me. I didn't know what to say. Yeah? I can't believe I didn't notice him before. He couldn't have walked up. There were too many sticks and leaves and crap on the ground. I would have heard him. That means he was there the whole time. From the moment I saw the spiderweb of wire, he saw me. He just sat there, looking me up and down. Didn't say a word. He finally saw the pipe in my hand. "What's with the pipe?" I said, "Protection? Just in case of a wolf or something." "A wolf?" He cackled like a manic witch. "That all that's out here, boy?" Now I was getting really uneasy. I didn't like any of this. "Why don't you follow me back to my house and we'll call your parents?" I didn't know I could ever run that fast. I beat the devil, I know it. Leapt over that creepy fence and flew back to my house. Funnily enough, it seemed like the trip back went 1,000 times faster than the trip in. It seemed like I got home in like 20 minutes. Never told anyone. Parents would never believe me. Never went back either. First time I've ever told this story. I still don't get it to this day. What was the point of the spiderweb? Just a sicko living in the middle of nowhere? Off the grid?